February 14th. A night when the world celebrates love. But for Margaret Chen, a 52-year-old housekeeper standing in a mansion worth more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes, this Valentine's Day would mark the beginning of something else entirely. Something Richard Maxwell never saw coming. He stood there, champagne glass raised, surrounded by Silicon Valley's elite, red roses everywhere, designer dresses catching the light like diamonds. And then he did it. In front of everyone. He humiliated her. Made a joke about how even his maid couldn't find love because who would want someone who cleans toilets for a living? The room erupted in laughter. Phones came out. Someone recorded it. Margaret stood there, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her face burning with shame, but her eyes, if you looked closely, they weren't filled with tears. They were calculating. By the end of that year, Richard Maxwell's $50 million empire was in ruins, his name was dragged through every major newspaper in the country, and federal investigators were knocking on his door. And it all traced back to that one Valentine's Day mistake. Because what Richard Maxwell didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Margaret Chen had been preparing for this moment for 7 years. This is a story about 3 things: power, patience, and the dangerous assumption that the people who serve you aren't paying attention. Richard Maxwell, 47 years old, tech entrepreneur, venture capitalist, self-made billionaire. The media loved him. Time magazine. Forbes. He was the American dream personified. Then there was Margaret Chen. Widowed. Immigrant. Housekeeper. The woman nobody noticed. The woman everyone underestimated. On Valentine's Day 2018, in front of 50 of San Francisco's wealthiest people, Richard made one joke. One careless, cruel joke. But here's what nobody understood that night: Margaret didn't just clean Richard's house. She organized his files. She answered his phones when his assistant was out. She saw the documents left on his desk. She heard the conversations he had when he thought she was just another piece of furniture. And for 7 years, she had been watching. Listening. Remembering. What no one knew was that Margaret Chen had a photographic memory. And she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe and let's prove her wrong. Richard Maxwell didn't start rich. That's what made his story so compelling to the public. Born in Sacramento to a single mother who worked 2 jobs, he put himself through Stanford on scholarships and student loans. He created his first tech startup at 26, sold it for $8 million at 29, and never looked back. By 35, he was worth $20 million. By 40, $50 million. But here's what the magazine profiles never mentioned: success didn't just change Richard's bank account. It erased something fundamental in him. The ability to see other people as human beings. His employees had a saying: Richard Maxwell doesn't have colleagues, he has assets and liabilities. You either made him money or you were in the way. His annual Valentine's Day party wasn't about romance. It was about power. About showing everyone in Silicon Valley exactly how far he'd climbed, how much he'd won, how untouchable he'd become. He'd invite tech CEOs, venture capitalists, politicians. The champagne alone cost more than most people's monthly rent. And every year, there'd be a moment. A moment when Richard would make some comment, some joke at someone's expense. Usually it was a waiter. Sometimes a valet. Once, it was his own chef. In 2018, it was Margaret. Margaret Chen arrived in America in 1995 at 29 years old. She came from a small village outside Taipei, Taiwan, with her husband David and their 6-year-old daughter Amy. David was an engineer. Smart. Ambitious. They had dreams of the American life they'd seen in movies. For the first few years, it worked. David got a job at a tech company in Silicon Valley. Margaret stayed home with Amy, learned English from library books and television shows. They saved every penny. But in 2003, everything changed. David's company, a promising startup, went public. The CEO, a man named Richard Maxwell, had promised stock options to early employees. David had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years, believing that when the company went public, their family would finally be secure. The company went public. David got nothing. There was fine print in his contract. Clauses he didn't understand because English wasn't his first language. Loopholes that Richard Maxwell's lawyers had carefully constructed. Technically legal. Morally bankrupt. David spiraled. Depression. Then a heart attack at 41 years old. Margaret was left alone with a teenage daughter, medical bills that consumed their savings, and a fury that burned so quietly, nobody could see it. She took the first job she could find. Cleaning houses. She was overqualified. Back in Taiwan, she'd been an accountant, but in America, with her accent and her circumstances, this was what was available. For years, she moved from house to house, invisible, forgettable. And then, in 2011, through a placement agency, she got a call. A wealthy entrepreneur in San Francisco needed a full-time housekeeper. The pay was good. Live-in position. The man's name was Richard Maxwell. Margaret recognized it immediately. Margaret accepted the job the same day. She moved into the small bedroom on the 3rd floor of Richard's Pacific Heights mansion. 1,200 square feet. Her room was maybe 80. She worked 6 days a week. Sometimes 7 when Richard hosted events. She cleaned. She cooked when the private chef was off. She did laundry. She organized. And she watched. Richard barely acknowledged her existence. To him, she was part of the house's infrastructure, like the heating system or the security cameras. He'd leave confidential documents on his desk. Have phone conversations about business deals while she vacuumed nearby. Talk to his lawyers, his accountants, his investors, as if she wasn't even there. For 7 years, Margaret absorbed everything. She had a notebook hidden in her room. Every night, she'd write down what she'd seen. Dates. Names. Numbers. Conversations. She didn't know if it would ever matter. But she remembered what Richard Maxwell had taken from her family. And she waited. February 14, 2018. Richard's annual Valentine's Day party. Margaret had worked since 6 a.m. preparing. The florist had delivered 300 red roses. The caterer had brought enough food for a wedding. By 7 p.m., guests started arriving. Black ties. Designer gowns. Laughter that sounded more like competition than joy. Margaret moved through the crowd invisibly. Refilling champagne glasses. Clearing plates. At 9:30 p.m., Richard was drunk. Not sloppy drunk. Richard Maxwell never lost control completely. But drunk enough that his cruelty sharpened into performance. He was standing near the grand piano, surrounded by a group of venture capitalists and their wives. Someone made a joke about Valentine's Day being invented by greeting card companies. Everyone laughed. Richard, feeling the energy in the room, decided to add to it. He pointed at Margaret, who was walking by with a tray of desserts. "You know who I feel bad for on Valentine's Day?" he said loudly. The conversation stopped. People turned. Margaret stopped walking. "My housekeeper," Richard continued, smiling. "I mean, who's going to buy flowers for someone who spends their day cleaning other people's toilets?" The room erupted. Laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. Genuine amusement. Someone pulled out their phone and started recording. Richard, encouraged, kept going. "Margaret, do you even know what romance is? Or is that something you gave up when you started working for a living?" Margaret stood there. 52 years old. Widow. Mother. Woman who'd lost everything because of the man now mocking her. She could feel every eye in the room on her. Could hear the laughter echo off the vaulted ceilings. Could see the phones recording her humiliation. She looked directly at Richard Maxwell. And she smiled. Not a forced smile. Not a polite smile. A real smile. Then she set down the tray, walked to the kitchen, finished her shift, and went upstairs to her room. Everyone thought it was over. Richard forgot about it by the next morning. But Margaret, sitting in her small bedroom, opened her notebook to a fresh page. And she wrote, "Valentine's Day 2018. Richard Maxwell made his final mistake. If you're still watching right now, comment I'm still here. This story is about to take a turn no one expects." The video of Richard's joke went viral for about 48 hours. Some people criticized him online. Most forgot about it by the following week. Richard Maxwell's life continued exactly as it had before. New deals. New investments. New parties. By March, he'd closed a $30 million venture capital deal. By April, he was being profiled in Bloomberg. Margaret continued working. She showed up at 6 a.m. She cleaned. She cooked. She said, "Yes, Mr. Maxwell," when he gave her instructions. If anything, she seemed quieter than before. More invisible. Richard, on the rare occasions he thought about her at all, assumed she'd accepted her place. Assumed she understood that's just how the world worked. Some people give orders. Some people take them. But Margaret wasn't quiet because she'd accepted anything. Margaret was quiet because she was busy. Every lunch break, while Richard was out, she'd go to her room and make phone calls. She'd spend her one day off each week at the public library, using the computers. She was meticulous. Patient. She knew that if she was going to do this, she had to do it perfectly. Because she only had one shot. In June 2018, an anonymous tip was sent to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Someone had information about potential insider trading connected to several tech companies in Silicon Valley. The tip was detailed. Specific. It included dates, names, transaction amounts. The SEC gets hundreds of tips every month. Most lead nowhere. But this one had something different. Documentation. The investigation started quietly. A few phone calls. some preliminary research. By August, they'd opened a formal inquiry. By September, subpoenas were going out. Richard Maxwell's name appeared in the investigation in October. At first, his lawyers weren't concerned. Richard had excellent lawyers. Expensive lawyers. The kind who knew every loophole, every technicality. They assured him that even if the SEC was looking at some of his deals, they had nothing concrete. Everything Richard had done was technically legal. Aggressive, yes. Questionable, maybe. But legal. What they didn't know was that someone had kept records. 7 years of records. Dates when Richard had left insider information on his desk. Phone conversations overheard about deals that hadn't been announced yet. Emails he'd printed and forgotten about. Stock purchases made hours before major announcements. All documented. All dated. All organized. The SEC investigation expanded. News started to leak. Bloomberg ran a story in November, SEC investigating prominent Silicon Valley investor. Richard's lawyers went into crisis mode. They couldn't understand where the information was coming from. Every time they thought they'd contained one issue, another document would surface. Another witness would come forward. On December 3, 2018, Margaret didn't show up for work. Richard noticed only because his morning coffee wasn't ready. He tried calling her phone. No answer. He checked her room. Empty. Her belongings were gone. At first, Richard was annoyed. Finding a new housekeeper would be inconvenient. But then, as the day went on and the SEC investigation continued to tighten around him, a thought occurred to him. A terrible thought. He called his lawyer. "My housekeeper quit," he said. "The one who's worked for me for 7 years." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "When?" the lawyer asked. "This morning." "She's gone." Another pause. "Then, we need to talk. In person. Now." Because Richard's lawyer had just received another batch of documents from the SEC, documents that couldn't have come from anyone in Richard's office. Documents that could only have come from someone who'd been in his house. Someone who'd seen the papers on his desk. Someone who'd heard the phone calls. Someone who'd been invisible for 7 years. That was the last mistake Richard Maxwell ever made. Assuming that the people who served him weren't capable of fighting back. If this hooked you already, don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop a comment because what happens next will absolutely shatter your expectations. The documents Margaret had collected weren't just notes. They were evidence of a pattern that spanned nearly a decade. She'd photographed documents using a phone she'd bought specifically for that purpose. She'd recorded conversations, legally, because California is a two-party consent state for phone calls, but there's no expectation of privacy when you're speaking loudly enough for your housekeeper to overhear naturally in the course of her work. She'd kept every scrap of paper Richard had thrown away. Every email he'd printed and discarded. Every memo he'd left on his desk. And here's what made Margaret Chen extraordinary. She understood how to build a case. Back in Taiwan, before she came to America, she'd worked as a forensic accountant. She'd helped investigate corporate fraud. She knew what regulators needed. She knew how to document. How to organize. How to present information in a way that was impossible to dismiss. For 7 years, she'd worked for Richard Maxwell. And for 7 years, she'd been building an ironclad case against him. The SEC investigation revealed everything. Richard Maxwell had been using insider information for years. He'd made millions from trades that violated securities laws. He'd used shell companies to hide transactions. He'd lied to investors. He'd manipulated stock prices. All of it documented. All of it dated. All of it provided by an anonymous source who turned out to be a 52-year-old housekeeper nobody had paid attention to. But there was more. Margaret didn't just go to the SEC. She went to the IRS. Because when she'd organized Richard's tax documents over the years, she'd noticed discrepancies. Income that wasn't reported. Deductions that were fraudulent. Over 7 years, Richard Maxwell had evaded nearly $4 million in taxes. The night before the story broke publicly, Margaret sat in a small apartment in Oakland that she'd rented with money she'd saved over 7 years of working for Richard Maxwell. She looked at a photograph on her wall. Her husband David. Smiling. Young. Before Richard Maxwell's company had destroyed him. She thought about Amy, her daughter, now 30 years old, a nurse, working 2 jobs to pay off student loans because they'd lost everything when David died. She thought about the promises Richard Maxwell had made to his employees. The stock options. The American dream. She thought about Valentine's Day. About standing in that mansion holding a tray while 50 people laughed at her. And she felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years. Not revenge. Something quieter. Justice. The next morning, the Wall Street Journal ran the story on its front page: Silicon Valley investor facing federal charges in insider trading scheme. By noon, every major news outlet had picked it up. By evening, Richard Maxwell's face was on every television screen in America. Not as the self-made billionaire. Not as the American success story. As a criminal. If you're still here, subscribe, because stories like this only work when people stay. Here's what nobody expected: Margaret Chan never testified publicly. She never gave interviews. She never showed her face on camera. Everything she provided to authorities was done anonymously through lawyers. The SEC couldn't force her to testify because she'd submitted everything voluntarily. She hadn't broken any laws. She hadn't stolen anything. She'd simply kept records of things she'd observed in the normal course of her employment. Every photograph of a document had been taken of papers that were left in plain sight. Every conversation she'd overheard had been spoken loud enough for her to hear naturally while she worked. Every piece of evidence was obtained legally. Richard Maxwell's lawyers tried everything. They tried to discredit the evidence. They tried to argue entrapment. They tried to claim privacy violations. None of it worked. Because Margaret Chan had been more careful, more thorough, more patient than anyone had given her credit for. In March 2019, Richard Maxwell was indicted on 12 counts of securities fraud and 3 counts of tax evasion. His assets were frozen. His mansion was seized. His reputation was destroyed. By June, he'd accepted a plea deal. 7 years in federal prison. $20 million in fines and restitution. Everything he'd built, everything he'd won, gone. And Margaret Chan walked away quietly. She moved to Oregon. Bought a small house near her daughter. Got a job as a bookkeeper at a local nonprofit. She never spoke about what she'd done. Never sought credit. Never wanted fame. But the prosecutors who worked on the Richard Maxwell case knew. They knew that without her, none of it would have been possible. One of them, a woman named Jennifer Torres, tried to thank Margaret after the trial ended. She found her address and sent a letter. Margaret never responded. But Jennifer later told colleagues what she'd written in that letter: "You showed them that dignity has value. That patience has power. That the people they underestimate are often the ones they should fear most." Think about what Margaret Chen actually did. She didn't break any laws. She didn't seek revenge in the traditional sense. She simply held someone accountable for the harm they'd caused. Richard Maxwell took her husband's life, destroyed her family's future, and then mocked her on Valentine's Day for being. He thought her powerless. He was wrong. Because power doesn't always look like money or status or mansions in Pacific Heights. Sometimes power looks like a 52-year-old woman with a photographic memory and a notebook full of dates and names and numbers. Sometimes power looks like patience. Like spending 7 years watching and waiting and building a case so thorough that it's impossible to fight. Richard Maxwell destroyed Margaret's family because he could. Because the system allowed it. Because nobody held him accountable. Margaret Chen destroyed Richard Maxwell's empire because he deserved it. Because justice sometimes takes time. Because the people you underestimate are often the ones who break you in the end. Was this revenge or justice? So let me ask you something. If you were in Margaret's position, what would you have done? If someone had destroyed your family, mocked you publicly, treated you as less than human for 7 years, would you have had the patience she had? The discipline? Or would you have walked away? And here's the harder question: did Richard Maxwell deserve what happened to him? He broke laws, yes. But would he have been held accountable without Margaret? The system failed to protect David Chen. It failed to protect the other employees Richard cheated. It only worked when someone spent 7 years building a case strong enough that it couldn't be ignored. What does that say about justice in America? How many other Richard Maxwells are out there right now, assuming that the people who work for them are too powerless to fight back? How many Margarets are watching, waiting, remembering? Think about the last time you saw someone be cruel to a waiter, a housekeeper, a janitor. Think about how easy it is to assume that kindness doesn't matter because those people don't matter. Richard Maxwell learned the hard way that everyone matters. That everyone is watching. That cruelty always has a cost. He just didn't expect to pay it. And if this story shocked you, wait until you hear about what happened on the next video. Subscribe if you believe that dignity is priceless. Like if you think patience is power. Share this with someone who's ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they didn't matter. Because this is what happens when the invisible become impossible to ignore. This is what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. This is what happens when Valentine's Day becomes Judgment Day.